All right, learning objective number 2 is to identify and describe theories of punishment. Now, the textbook goes into detail on these different types or theories as to why we prescribe punishment. But I think it's important to note that punishment always involves doing something that is wrong. And, right, it is, if we think of this from an ethical perspective, whenever we punish someone, we are doing something that is harmful, that is unpleasant, and that speaks in the face of of much of what we've argued is ethics, right? Our job is to bring about the most happiness for the most amount of people, to not treat people as means to an end. The golden rule that we should do to other people what we would want done to ourselves. Um, Punishment at its very face is doing something wrong or painful or harmful to another person. And so it is essential that there are reasons that we can justify why we, as members of a society, are doing something that is starkly in the face of what we believe ought to be done, right? I was spanked as a child. Right? If you just imagine someone being beaten as a child, right, that is wrong. And so, in order to do something like that, in order to spank a child, you have to have a justification, a reasoning in your mind, right, which is sufficient to explain to you and to other members of society why that punishment is necessary. And so, there are a couple of theories here provided. Retribution, deterrence, prevention, rehabilitation, and the protection of society. I'm not going to go into detail into each of these, as I assume reading through the textbook can give you a thorough understanding of what each of these are. However, allow me just to speak to a few of these. So let me start with retribution. Now, retribution or Retribution is fairly commonsensical theory of punishment. Many of us who have grown up in religious families or are at all in tune with popular culture have heard the slogan, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? And this speaks back to Judaism and the Old Testament, kind of old Israel, and their ideas about punishment, that if you punch me in the eye, a fair punishment is me punching you in the eye. If you knock out my tooth, well, I should be able to knock out your tooth. And so this is often used as a way of expressing the need for punishment. Elsewhere, we see metaphors like the scales of justice, right? And the scales of justice are supposed to be balanced, that the crime fits the punishment. But the central difficulty in literal retribution is that there are many crimes for which, one, it would be impossible for us to impose the crime itself on the perpetrator. For example, something like prostitution. And second, it would be cruel and unusual for us to impose the crime on the perpetrator. Or three, a mixture of the first and the second. Most of those who accept this idea of retribution prefer a proportional retribution, which insists merely that the punishment must fit the crime. I know the textbook notes that this is the only theory of punishment that does not take into account the effect of the punishment on society. And let's look at the second one, deterrence. So the core idea behind deterrence as a theory for punishment is that the punishment then keeps other people, not necessarily the guilty party, from committing crimes, right? And so we are signaling to the rest of society that we do not tolerate this type of behavior or the breaking of this law, rule, or standard. And as a way of demonstrating that to other people to prevent them or persuade them not to follow, we may eke out a punishment upon the guilty party as a way of deterring other people who would be fearful of being punished in the same way. I remember as a young child hearing about this case of an American tourist in Singapore, I think, who littered on the ground and was caught by the police and was sentenced to like 50, I think he was caned, which seems kind of barbaric in kind of contemporary American society. But in, I think it was Singapore, they felt that caning somebody, even an American tourist, was a fair punishment for that crime, largely because it deterred others from committing that same crime. Right? Anyone who drops a gum wrapper on our streets, well, you better get ready to get caned. So one potential problem with deterrence, considered as a sole justification for punishment, is that it could license punishments that go far beyond what would be proportional. So take, for example, torturing vandals to death might be exceptionally effective deterrent, but I think most of us would agree that that is a bit excessive. Think about the Philippines and their president, which more or less has legalized the killing of drug users and drug sellers. Right? So somebody, sorry, this just paused on me. So somebody who purchases some marijuana on the corner of the street suddenly gets shot to death by a citizen who's meaning to do good. Yeah, you know what? If I was a drug user or a drug pusher in the Philippines, I would be scared to death. In fact, I would reconsider my life choices. Like, okay, this is probably not the best time for me to be doing either of these things. But I think we could also decide, logically speaking, that that's not really a fair punishment. It doesn't fit the crime.